Even before the Beatles broke up in 1970, there was considerable interest in telling their story. Hunter Davies published in 1968 the first authorized biography of the band, written with the full cooperation of the Beatles, but with a series of restrictions. He was forbidden to talk about drugs or the Beatles' stories with groupies during their touring years. Once the group was split up, a great number of formats such as magazines, books, documentaries, fiction films, and even musicals tried to tell the band's story. But in search of an official version since 1970, Neil Aspinall, a personal friend of the band and director of Apple Corp., formalized his attempt to launch a documentary of the Beatles. For years, he had collected interviews and television appearances of the Beatles from around the world, and with a gigantic archive behind him, he began work on The Long and Winding Road.
I collected all the footage that I could find from around the world, and we put a documentary together, or a film together, that was without the Beatles being interviewed or anything like that. It was just put all the film together. It was about an hour and 3/4 long.
Although Apple said the film would be in theaters by Christmas of 1970, the October 1970 issue of Beatles Book Monthly, the band's official fan magazine, had confirmed it as a side project to the Let It Be film. The 90-minute footage had its first formal cut until 1971. At that time, none of the former members had any direct involvement in the project, and soon after, McCartney testified in court that he would have no further involvement in the film. Aspinall had no choice but to postpone the project until the band's legal problems were resolved. In 1972, Apple announced that the production of the film had resumed and was now titled 10 Years in the Life of the Beatles. The production of the film would continue throughout the 1970s. John Lennon also mentioned that the film was still in the works during an interview on The Today Show in 1974. At the end of the decade, Eric Idle was producing his 1978 Beatles parody special, The Ruttles, All You Need Is Cash.
Here it was that the Prefab Four, Dirk, Nasty, Stig, and Barry, the Ruttles, the singing phenomena who made the 60s what they are today, here it was that indeed they were just...
Do you think they'll ever get back together again?
I hope not.
George Harrison, a very good friend of Idle's, lent him a video copy of the documentary to research. Scenes from the Ruttles film include footage identical to Diesel Hoffman's 1963 8mm films of the band. Between 1977 and 1979, the Beatlemania musical had become popular on Broadway. It generated divided opinions and rejection among the four Beatles. On November 28, 1980, John Lennon wrote a legal statement against the producers of the Beatlemania musical that said, "I and the 3 other former Beatles have plans to stage a reunion concert," he said, referring to an event that was to be filmed as the finale of The Long and Winding Road, which was now to become a television special. According to Yoko Ono, the concert would have been held in England. Just days before his brutal death, John was making plans to go to England for a triumphant Beatles reunion. His greatest dream was to recreate the musical magic of the early years with Paul, George, and Ringo. He felt that they had traveled down different roads for a long time. He felt that they had grown up and were mature enough to try to write and record new songs. The alleged plan for a reunion was abandoned after Lennon was killed on December 8th. Paul, George, and Ringo met a couple of times during the 1980s, but at the end of the decade, they had differences, such as their altercation in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But in 1989, the 3 Beatles together with Yoko smoothed over their differences to start business meetings that aimed to make the official story of the band. Their popularity levels were still latent, and a new generation had connected with their music. The title of the documentary was now changed to The Beatles Anthology, as George Harrison was against naming the entire Beatles career after a Paul McCartney song.
I really thought the anthology would happen when Neil said there's going to be an anthology, we're going to do the whole story. And the fellas have agreed, and then I knew it would be on. And I was very interested in a detached sort of way.
You know, I think maybe I mentioned it to everybody in sort of like 1990 or 91 or something like that, you know. And then we started doing it. You know, I got the production team together, the production office together, and you know, we started doing it.
Conceived as a 6-part documentary series, this time, George, Paul, and Ringo would be directly involved, giving film interviews with Jools Holland and using archive footage left behind by John Lennon, with Neil Aspinall, the band's press agent Derek Taylor, and their longtime producer, George Martin, joining them in the construction of the story. In addition to this mega project, a 3-album compilation was to be added, and the possibility of recording new material was considered.
That's the best.
We are gathered here today. That's good.
If we were to do something, the three of us, as interesting as it may be, and as nice as we could, sure, make it, to have John in it is the obvious thing.
We kept hitting that wall because this is a documentary on the Beatles. It's not on Paul, George, and Ringo.
In January 1994, Yoko Ono gave 2 cassette tapes to Paul McCartney, at his request, with the home recordings of Lennon. Free as a Bird, Real Love, Grow Old With Me, and Now and Then were the songs included on the recordings. George Martin could no longer produce due to his hearing problems. At George Harrison's request, Jeff Lynne came in as producer to mediate a bit of the group's dynamic. He had worked with George on previous projects, and Harrison felt that with him producing, he could contrast Paul's power a bit, who reluctantly agreed. The sessions flowed, and he later, McCartney, ended up recording an album with him, Flaming Pie. Grow Old With Me was discarded as it was not completely unreleased, as it was released on John Lennon's posthumous 1984 album, Milk and Honey. Free as a Bird would be the first song to be released, this for Anthology Volume 1.
And in actual fact, we didn't know as much as most Lennon fans, because they'd actually knew all the releases. They knew that Free as a Bird and Real Love had been heard. They'd heard them. So when we got in the studio, we had this cassette of Free as a Bird. It was very bad quality. It was just a mono cassette with John and the piano locked in on one track, which nobody would normally deal with. You know, you just think, oh, I can't deal with this. But the song was so strong that we overcame those technical difficulties, or rather Jeff Lynne did, who was producing.
It wasn't an easy thing because they were like mono tapes and John singing on them with the piano as well. And so you couldn't really separate anything. So John is actually playing piano on the records too, you know, which is a great thing. So it kept the integrity of that, and it wasn't like his voice just appearing out of nowhere. He was actually doing a performance at the same time. Technically, it was virtually impossible to do it. But we did it, you know, because we really worked at it very hard.
I mean, just hearing the tape that was sent was pretty emotional. And then we got to the studio, and it was difficult for a while. I mean, what? You know, he's not here. We're all here. Where's John? Of course, John's in heaven. And but we had to get over that. We got over that by feeling that he'd gone for lunch. He's gone for a cup of tea, or he's, you know, because all the time we were making records, we weren't all in the room all the time. I mean, sometimes we would split. And so we dealt with it in that way. That's how I dealt with it, and he's just around the corner.
The stars speak.
Everybody always says to me, you want to be Paul McCartney, don't you?
The premiere of the first new Beatles song for 25 years, tonight, 8:30.
Whatever happened to
The song was released as a single on December 4th, 1995, to complement the promotion of the documentary that had been broadcast in 3 parts on Sunday, November 19th, Wednesday, November 22nd, and Thursday, November 23rd of that year. The music video for Free as a Bird was produced by Vincent Joliet and directed by Joe Pitka. And through the movement of the camera, which alluded to a flying bird, the history of the band was revisited through dozens of references. The Beatles' recordings and production were made between February and March 1994 in Sussex, England, in a McCartney's home studio. The track ends with a gentle coda, and included a ukulele segment played by Harrison and Lennon's voice used in backwards. According to McCartney, was unintentional and only discovered after the remaining Beatles reviewed the final version.
It was something I'll never forget, obviously, you know, it's just fondest.
What
was it?
No, it was just a weird blue flame.
That was John.
I'll tell you something, man.
Is there?
Weird, man.
That's all right, it's okay, leave it in, it was John.
The song was first broadcast on BBC Radio 1 in the early hours of November 20th, 1995. It was released as a single in the UK on December 4th of the same year, 2 weeks after its appearance as part of the Anthology 1 album. It sold 120,000 copies in the first week, entering the UK singles chart in second place. However, Michael Jackson's Earth Song will later dethrone it. In total, it remained in the charts for 8 weeks. In the United States, it reached the 6th position in the Billboard Hot 100, becoming the band's 34th single to enter the top 10.
I vote for the E suspended. What do you think, audience?
We changed arrangements, we added parts, and we wrote lyrics, and then we made the multi-track tape of this song, and then took John's voice and laid him into the track.
Real Love, take one. All the little plans and schemes.
The second song released was Real Love. Lennon performed 6 takes of the song in 1979 and 1980 with Real Life, a different song that was merged with Real Love. The song was ignored until 1988, when the 6th take was used on the soundtrack of the documentary Imagine. McCartney, Harrison, and Starr agreed that the recording of Free as a Bird was more enjoyable for them than Real Love, as the latter was almost finished and there was very little to add. So, they felt they were simply Lennon's accompanists. The song reached number 4 and number 11 on the UK and US singles charts respectively, and was certified gold faster than the group's other singles. The song was not included on the British Broadcast Corporation's Radio 1 playlist, prompting criticism from fans and members of the UK Parliament.
This was more like we were sidemen to John, which was joyful and it was good fun, and I think we did a good job.
If the initial enthusiasm for Free as a Bird waned radically with Real Love, it waned much more when they got to work on Now and Then, the third song that would accompany Volume 3 of the Anthology's work, which began in March 1995. They did the instrumentals track and backing vocals to be mixed with the demo. However, after only 2 days of recording, all work on the song was ultimately abandoned and not included on the compilation album. The little technological possibility to solve it, a noise that could not be removed, added to Harrison's life enthusiasm to continue, made the band leave the project aside. And George Martin's A Beginning took its place in the compilation.
But there were 3 that we liked. Free as a Bird, Real Love. And so those were the 2 that we did. And there was another one that we started working on, but George went off it. Fucking hell. Fucking rubbish, this is. It was like, no, George, this is John. It's still fucking rubbish, you know. Oh, okay then. So that one's still lingering around somewhere. I'm going to nick in with Jeff and do it, finish it one of these days.
The documentary received generally positive reviews, despite how subjective the story could be told due to the official treatment it was given. Important people in the band's history, such as Pete Best, were not considered for the project. McCartney, Harrison, and Starr provided insight into their legend from the mature perspective of men in their 50s, while Lennon's reflections originated mainly when he was in his 20s and 30s. Watching the interviews separately, the 3 surviving Beatles did not always recall events in the same way. Compromises had to be made so as not to offend sensitivities, particularly with regard to the events that resulted in the 1970 breakup.
These are Paul's notes for Programme 1 changes. There's not very many, as you can see. We're doing a good job here. Sack the crew. That's one person.
Many people dismissed the result as more than a diplomatic celebration rather than a definitive account of the Beatles' history. The subsequent release was followed by a book published in October 2000, and an avant-garde piece called Hiroshima Sky is Always Blue by Paul and Yoko also accompanied the band's projects in that period. Between 2005 and 2006, according to the Sun press rumors, the only 2 surviving Beatles today, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, met and discussed the release of this unreleased song in which all 4 members of the Beatles would collaborate in one way or another. The Daily Express reported on April 29, 2007, that the song would use fragments of John Lennon's ballad. The plan was for Ringo Starr to play drums while, in order to ensure George Harrison's posthumous participation, some existing recording from the 1995 archive would be used. But the reunion went no further on Paul and Ringo's part. However, McCartney repeatedly expressed his intentions to finish it, and even tried to record it for his album, Memory Almost Full. Despite the expectations created, Now and Then was never completed as advertised. Finally, a mix that became very popular in 2007 called 1995 Edition was circulated. Another new one made by fans was released in 2009, perhaps the best-known version of Now and Then before the official release. Despite the good quality of this production, the remix did not contain any samples of the material recorded by the Beatles in 1995. This recording became popular in the early days of YouTube and was the first approach of many people to the song. Now and Then had been in Paul McCartney's head for years. After several failed attempts, it was Peter Jackson who, aware of the technical problems of the recording, offered his software to isolate John's voice, clean it, and now be able to work from zero. Now and Then was catalogued as the last song of the Beatles. It was in 2023 when McCartney made the announcement that the song had finally been finished and that it would be released. The fact of mentioning artificial intelligence made the media and people confused as to whether John Lennon's voice was original or not. After clarifying that the use of this was only for the processes of separating John's voice from the original tape, the release was scheduled for November 2nd, 2023.
This is the last track ever that you'll get the 4 Beatles on a track: John, Paul, George and Ringo.
The song, which in its demo was already emotionally powerful despite being a home recording, talked about an old bond, about starting over and the feeling of missing someone. The discussions about whether this song was a statement by Lennon towards his relationship with Paul have been going on since the recording was first leaked. The fact that it was given to McCartney on a cassette that said, "For Paul," made people think that maybe John had written it. But the theory is not confirmed, and it is suggested that the people who wrote "For Paul" was Yoko Ono, as they were the recordings she gave him for the Anthology project. On whether the song was a song for Paul or not, Giles Martin said a few days ago, "I do feel as though Now and Then is a love letter to Paul written by John. I mean, I've never really asked Paul about it, but that's the sense I get. And I get the feeling that's why Paul was determined to finish it." Now and Then goes beyond the Beatles' last song. It was personal to Paul. It is impossible not to be moved just by listening to it. If we add to that the last words Lennon said to McCartney before he died were, "Won't you think about me every now and then?" And if you then think that years after his death, a cassette tape arrived to Paul when Lennon sings, "Every now and then I miss you," it makes this closing even more symbolic. You understand why Paul never gave up on finishing it. Now and Then comes to be the brilliant final statement that the Beatles and their fans deserved. It feels like a farewell, something finished today.
Very nice day. Thanks for having us, George.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's been really beautiful and moving. I like hanging out with you two guys.
Little churchy face.